finish up this psalm this evening, Psalm 78. This has been a four-part psalm, 72 verses, the longest psalm I think we've had so far. But in Psalm 78, verses 58 through 72, I titled it God's Rightful Judgments and Redeeming Promise. God's Rightful Judgments and Redeeming Promise. And starting at verse 58, and remember, I guess it's been 2 weeks ago now, the live stream we did, we dealt with up to verse 57, and it was looking at, this psalm is really almost kind of retelling a historical story. It's looking back at Genesis, looking back at Exodus, and you can actually follow along the Hebrew story, and walking through the wilderness, the crossing of the Red Sea, wandering in the wilderness, frustrating at receiving begging for manna. God gives them manna, begging for water. God brings water out of a rock. I think we talked about the meat in their mouths, and God gave them an illness, and they got sick, and some of them died. And so you have just ongoing back and forth of God provides, they receive it, they're thankful for a little while, then they're right back to whining the very next day sometimes. And God just does this back and forth. And we've talked about the cycle of sin. We've talked about how that's just it's a common man-made, it's a human nature occurrence. It's always going to happen. And we see Israel going through this over and over and over again. And in verse 57, I'll just read that for context, it says, we'll go to 55. He cast out the heathen also before them and divided them an inheritance by line and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Verse 56. Yet they tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not his testimonies, but turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. And that's talking about the time when they entered the land of Canaan. Abraham had taken them up to that point. No, it was Moses. Moses had taken them to that point. They resisted that. They said, we're like grasshoppers. We can't handle these big giants. He sent them back in the wilderness. They came back with Joshua. God gave them victory after victory after victory. And then in their 56, or in 55, he says he allowed them to divide up the land in inheritance. And there's maps you can find, and it shows all 12 tribes and their land that they got within that area of Israel today. Judah has the biggest section. In dead center, you have the Simeon section, but Judah has the city of Jerusalem in it. That's where Judah's territory would have been at. I'll make reference to that a little bit later. But then comes the time of the judges, and verse 58 is where that starts. Verse 58, where we'll start today, says, "For they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images." And it's an exciting book to read, the book of Judges. I'm sure you have read that. It can be a very interesting book. There's 8 to 9 judges listed in that book. And unfortunately, it always starts with the judge comes in, they have a huge battle, they defeat a king, or they overthrow an oppressive foreign nation that's taken over. And then the judge lives for 40, 50 so years, and then they die, and then Israel goes right back to following Balaam, or goes back to saying, well, hey, look at this God, I like him, let's build a high place, let's build a mound of dirt, have an altar on top, let's sacrifice to that God, whatever the case is. And verse 58 is referring to that. They provoke God to anger by making these places. They provoke God to anger by bringing in these other graven images, Dagon from the Philistines, Baal, other gods they bring in. And so God allows them to go through a time of judgment. Verse 59. When God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel. And Judges has that routine. He allows a king to come in, a king to build up power. The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Jebusites, other nations rise up, and they take control for a while. And they rule. They're very harsh with Israel. They treat them as slaves, or they oppress them in different ways. The story of Gideon. Gideon's dad had an altar to a false god right in their backyard. Gideon was threshing wheat because he's like, these Midianites are going to find this wheat and steal it from us. And his whole story is an example of that. And so God allowed the Midianites to control and really oppress Israel for a while. That was part of the judgment. And then out of obedience, as they obey Gideon, which was a man of God, they're freed from that oppression again. And then yet they go right back to it again. Verse 60. So that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men. We'll read through verse 64. and delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. The priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. This is again speaking of a very specific time in history. If you want to turn, or I'll just read it as well, 1 Samuel chapter 4. And so, coming out of the time of the judges, you have one of the last judges was Samuel. In 1 Samuel 4, and we won't read that whole chapter, but pieces of it. Samuel was one of the last judges, and God put him in a very interesting spot because he gets to serve alongside Eli, which was the high priest at that time. And unfortunately, Eli had at least two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And earlier, before chapter 4, it actually says Hophni and Phinehas did not know the Lord. They were priests, but they did not know the Lord. Very, very sad. And they did a lot of very evil things. They're very immoral in the work that they did in the tabernacle. They actually slept with women that came to worship, even though they were married. They were cheating on their wives with women that would come. There was rules about the meat they could take in sacrifices that God had said, as priests, and this is right, priests were coming, and it was their right to take some meat for their own provision. But they would come in with these flesh hooks and they would jab in and take too much on purpose. And God said, no, that's not right. You're supposed to take it a certain way because that's my provision for you. So they were immoral. They were breaking religious practice codes that they were supposed to be following there in the tabernacle. And they just weren't godly people. Unfortunately, they were just not godly men at all. And so 1 Samuel 4 puts us in a place where the Philistines come in. An ungodly nation comes in, puts oppression on Israel. And they have a battle at the very first part there of 1 Samuel 4, and they kill 4,000 Israelites. And we've talked about this. David had these experiences as well. When you lose that many people, you realize, we did something wrong. God's not with us. We went out there as Israelites, God's people. We shouldn't have lost that badly. We shouldn't have lost 4,000 people. So they come back and they say, and unfortunately they were so spiritually depraved at this time. Their priests are not godly people. They said, let's bring out our rabbit's foot. Let's bring out our lucky charm. Let's bring out the Ark of the Covenant. And that was still there. It existed. It was in the tabernacle. It was in the city of Shiloh at the time. There wasn't rules yet about it needing to be in Jerusalem because there really was no nation yet. When you think about it, there's no centralized government. There's no king at this time. And so these are just really tribes that had their own territories, but they would come together to do battle and come together to support each other. But the tabernacle's in Shiloh. Eli's in Shiloh. Samuel's there in Shiloh. And they say, hey, Hophni and Phinehas, bring the Ark of the Covenant out. Let's use this. We show up. We have this with us in battle. We're going to win. And this story, verses 3 through 9, it shows that they brought it in. The Philistines heard the cry of Israel, and they said, there's the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to lose. And so they gain an extra, they almost kind of have a locker room pep talk. They get out there, and they slaughter 30,000 Israelites because God was not there. God was not there with that Ark of the Covenant. It was just a box covered in gold at that point. The presence, the Shekinah glory of God was not there. And God, and that's the reference there in in Psalm 78. He allowed there, and we won't just jump back and forth, but let's see here. Verse 60 of Psalm 78 says he forsook the tabernacle. He did. He wasn't there anymore. He did not dwell there in the Holy of Holies because that was not a place that was being run correctly. God's men, the priests, were not doing their job. And so the Philistines do great damage, kill 30,000 Israelites. They steal the Ark of the Covenant. They actually steal it as a trophy. They're super excited about that, and they kill Hophni and Phinehas. So the priests are dead. Those priests are dead, and that's referenced as well. The priests are killed by the sword in verse 64. Then a man from the battle runs back to Shiloh, and comes to give the very sad and unfortunate news. He comes to tell Eli, the father, the high priest, and it says, this is so sad, in verse 18, it says, and it came to pass when he made mention of the ark of God. So this man's coming, he's old, he can't see really well. He's sitting in a stool, and he says, hey, I hear the sounds of people, they're crying, what happened? And verse 18, he says, when he mentioned the ark of God, he fell from off the seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck brake, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. He heard that his sons died too. But guess what made him fall backwards and die? The Ark of the Covenant's gone. That was kind of their last. We still have that. Even though God wasn't there, even though God wasn't dwelling there, that was what made him fall backwards. That's what caused him to die. And the last reference I want to make note of is the end of verse 64. It says that the widows make no lamentation. Well, Phinehas had a wife, and she got ready to have a child. Verse 19 through 21 states that Phinehas' wife was about ready to give birth, and she hears the Ark of the Covenant's gone, your husband's gone, and your father-in-law has just died. She has the baby, and this is so sad. I've had the pleasure of seeing four young children come into the world. Beautiful thing. This woman's having this baby. She's going to die right after. She's so sad, and she gives him the name Ichabod. But God's glory has departed. Not because her husband is gone, not because Eli was gone, but she says here, the glory of God is departed from Israel because the ark of God is taken. That was the key thing. And so for this woman, we don't give her name here, and so she's not crying. Well, the key is that she did not cry for her husband. He was a cheater. Probably I thought he was a jerk. She definitely was sad that he was gone probably, but you don't see her wailing and crying for the loss of my son or my husband. It's because the Ark of the Covenant's gone. That got stolen. And so I think that chapter is just so, it is so dramatic. You just have so much ups and downs in that chapter, and yet it's a very vivid picture of this is how far Israel went. God had let this nation go into battle, just 34,000 Israelites destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant's gone. Sad things are happening, but they had left far before that. They had left the glory of God. They had left what God desired for them to do. And so this is all part of God's judgment. This is all part of God punishing his people for those high places, for turning away from God, for the priests not doing what they were supposed to do. Eli was rebuked as well for not being a good dad, for not doing the job that he should have to train those sons. He rebuked them a few times, tried to do the right thing, I think, but they were stubborn. They were stubborn men, and we think maybe they could have very well been, quite a bit older at that point when they went out to do this work of taking the ark out. But they did not know the Lord, and it was a very sad, very, very sad situation. Verse 65, it says, "Then the Lord awaked as one out of sleep, like a mighty man that shouted by reason of wine." The picture I get of that is, and this has happened a few times, to me specifically, I can think of it specifically, where you're sleeping and you're awakened suddenly. You're maybe dozing off and you're not in a deep, deep sleep, but you're awake enough that you hear a child scream or something fell and broke. You wake up quickly. That's the picture there. It's like God all of a sudden just bursts awake. Not that he was sleeping on the job or something went out of control, but all these terrible things have happened to his people. And then after the ark gets stolen, then he reacts. He awakes like a mighty man that shouts. When people have a little too much alcohol, they get kind of loud. That's the idea there is God. Again, God's not out of control. God's not sleeping on the job, but he's very loud and he's very quick in how he judges here. Verse 66, "And he smote his enemies in the hinder parts. He put them in a perpetual reproach." And that ends verse 60. That ends the judgment section. But verse 66 speaks specifically of what God did to the Philistines. When they stole the ark, even though God allowed them to steal it, and that was their punishment, that was the punishment for Israel to lose that, he didn't let the Philistines off. They took the ark and they brought it to Ashdod. That was one of several cities the Philistines had their own kind of separate little city kingdoms in that area, and Ashdod was one of those. It was right next to Gath, where Goliath was later born, but Ashdod was one of those Philistine cities. And they brought it to the temple of Dagon, their half-man, half-fish god, and they said, "Look at this. We stole the Israelites' trophy or / god, whatever they call this. Let's bring it to our God. Let's bring it as a trophy to our God." And I don't know if you've read this story before or not, but 1 Samuel 5, we see that God's not happy with his ark being in the temple of a pagan god. He allows Dagon falls over, his head breaks off, his hands break off, the idol's destroyed, and then they cause mice, or rats even, to totally just, not infiltrate, but just, infestation, I guess, of the city. The city of Ashdod's covered in rodents, and then the men get hemorrhoids. Terrible, painful. That's what the idea there is. in their hinder parts, in their private regions. Very embarrassing, very, very painful, and the men are infected that way. Then they said, hey, it's the Ark of the Covenant's doing this. We got rats everywhere. We're hurting here. Let's get this off over to the city of Ekron. They take it to Ekron. Ekron has the same problems. Rats, hemorrhoids, we're in pain. They load it up. They take it to Gath. Gath sees them coming and says, stop. we heard what happened before. You don't bring this here. And then they decide, at the end of chapter 5 of 1 Samuel, they say, you know what, let's give this back. This is more trouble than it's worth. And so they make, for the 5 cities, you have Ekron, Ashdod, Gath, Ashkelon, and one more, I forget the name. The five Philistine cities. They make a golden rat for each city. So you have 5 golden rats. And they actually make, and I don't know how they did this, but they made golden images of hemorrhoids. And they place these into the Ark of the Covenant as a gift back to God to say, here's gold, pure solid gold, and these are the images of the things you inflicted us with. I don't know what that would have even looked like. Terrible. They load them up in the ark, put it on a cart, and send it back home. They say they send these oxen, and God guides the cows home, and they go back into the territory of Israel. And so that's it. We're done with this. And so, again, stories just go, wow, you don't hear this in Sunday school, But that is, I don't know if you want to, but that is what God did to his enemies. And so he allows, even though he allowed it to be a punishment for Israel, he also punished the Philistines for what they did as well. So now, verse 67 through 57 or 72, is on a more of a positive note. We see, even after all this judgment, God keeps a promise. Verse 67, it says, moreover, after all this, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high places, like the earth which he hath established forever. He chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So going back up to verse 67, he says God refuses the tabernacle, or in this case, not speaking directly of the place of worship that we just talked about that God had actually abandoned, but that tabernacle, actual tent that would have been the center of the Jewish camp. In this case here, we're speaking of tabernacle of just dwelling places. The dwelling places or tents of the tribe of Joseph as an example. And so the question is raised here, well, who was the savior of Israel when they first started growing up as a nation before they went into Egypt? Well, it was Joseph. Judah was there, the son of Judah, the promised tribe that we see Christ coming through later. He was there, but he wasn't a part of anything redeeming or great or awesome. In fact, he was probably one of the brothers that tossed Joseph into the pit. So he wasn't pulled out yet I'm sure God selected him already, but he wasn't yet at the forefront of being a prominent figure in the story of leading up to Jesus. But Joseph's doing the work. Joseph's being the one that's redeeming. Joseph's the one that allowed the family to come back and actually be able to live and survive in Egypt. But God didn't choose Joseph. He chose Joseph for that specific time. He allowed Joseph to grow and mature and become a high-ranking leader in Egypt, but God didn't choose him to be the line that Jesus would come through. He didn't choose Ephraim, which was one of the sons of Joseph. Samuel was from the tribe of Ephraim. So Samuel seemed like a pretty prominent guy. I mean, he was the one that really, he was kind of the judge / prophet that kind of transitioned. He was the one that transitioned Israel from being nomadic, random nations, random people groups, to bringing them together as a solid nation under one king. He was the one that brought in King Saul. He's the one that anointed David. He was a good transitional leader there. He was very, very important. But God didn't choose him. God didn't choose Ephraim, that tribe of Ephraim, to be the tribe that would lead to Jesus. He chose Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved, which is where Jerusalem is on top of today. Jerusalem resides on Mount Zion, which is in the area which Judah received. That territory is very special to God, very important. He loves that area. He loves that city. He loves those people. He built his sanctuary like high palaces. He allows his tabernacle to be brought to Jerusalem. He allows his temple later on to be built there. Solomon built it. Then later, of course, we know if Ezra came back with the captives, refugees, they came back and rebuilt it. He allows that to be where his sanctuary is at. Like the earth, which he hath established forever. Really, the entire world is under God's control, but this special area of Jerusalem is very important to him. He chose David, David from the tribe of Judah, took him out of the sheepfolds, and then he makes reference to shepherds here in verse 71. And so we know that David was a shepherd. We know that David literally probably was in sheepfolds, probably was when Samuel called him and said, hey, come here. You know, all your brothers are failing the test. God hasn't chosen any of them to be the next king. You're with the stinky sheep. Come over here. I got something to do for you. I'm going to anoint you as the next king. Literally took him out of the sheepfolds. And then the reference in 71 connects to that previous job that David would have had. God guided David like a ewe great with young, and allowed him to be the one as a godly king to feed Jacob, to feed the nation of Israel. So desperately needed a godly king. And Saul fell short with that. David wasn't perfect, but God was, even at the end of his life, God said, David was a man after my own heart. And that says a lot. After even some pretty horrific things David did, David was still a godly man and a good king for that nation. And so, speaks to 71, at the very end of 71, it says Israel was God's inheritance, and we'll look at that even next week in the next psalm. That's a beautiful picture there. That's why God loves Israel, is because Israel is God's inheritance. God sees that as something he wants to foster and build up and invest in, and build up and become a strong nation someday. Right now, they exist, but they're a nation of unbelief. They're so extreme on the keeping of the laws, they've forgotten the Spirit, they've forgotten the relationship they have with God. And finally in verse 72, so he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. And really we could see that from that moment on, even after David's leadership for the rest of the time even up to now. Even though they haven't always been faithful, they haven't always been obedient, what has God done though? He has guided them, or fed them, with his integrity, and guided them with the skillfulness of his hands. And I'm so glad he's the one doing that. I think about if we try to do that ourselves, or if as a group of nations try to do that ourselves, or as people as a whole, we're just not good at having integrity. That is not something that lasts very long in the human nature. But yet God has that. That's God's nature. That's God's character. And so he's able to provide for Israel's needs with a pure heart and guide them, direct them, move them in the right direction. It ends there really with just kind of looking into the future. Asaph was writing this, and I believe he would have been a priest during the time of, just right after Nehemiah's time, and so he is just now seeing Israel kind of start putting the pieces back together, and yet he could honestly say God has done that. Even though we went through a time of punishment, God took them through times of punishment with the judges. God allowed Babylon to take over. God allowed Egypt to take over. God did that for Israel's benefit, but they always had the opportunity to obey. They always had the opportunity to trust God and see salvation, see redemption. Any questions about that? Any thoughts on that last section?